Well, thank you so much. I have gotten the warmest welcome the last 2 days that I've been here, and I'm still in awe of this incredible library. I'm so grateful for the invitation to come and to speak with everyone, but I've got to tell you the highlight was getting to walk through and look at rare books that I never imagined in my life I'd ever get a chance to see, much less peruse through these beautiful things. So my goal now, after seeing this incredible exhibit, is to figure out how we can get them to take that on the road so we can bring it to Baylor so my students and our faculty can see it. This is an incredible resource, and I'm very grateful to be here, and I thank you all for the warm welcome. I've had a difficult time deciding what all to talk about. There are so many things that stimulate you here, and so I've added some things, taken some things out. I hope I'm not disjointed, but there's so many things that I would really like to tell you. I will say, most of the time when you're talking about forensic science, we're not really ever called because something good happened. So no one ever said, guess what, come on in, this thing happened. It's always because something unmentionable or horrible has gone on. So we end up developing a rather interesting sense of humor, and I'll try to keep that so that you don't leave feeling a little bit sad at the end of the talk, and so it's not meant to be inappropriate. It keeps us going when we laugh about things. So this is kind of my dream, our skeletons, what they do in the lab when we're not there. With this being the science and CSI, when we started our forensic program at Baylor, we had a tremendous number of students that wanted to be involved. And I had a lot of really great conversations with administrators and saying they were worried that it was a fad. So I thought I would just talk about a couple of things along those lines. We have these great shows that came out that educated people about forensic science, got people interested. It was wonderful. We saw an increase in the number of females that wanted to be involved in science. But then you wonder, okay, do these students that are watching this when they're in junior high and high school, when they get to college, do they understand what's real? And they actually do. And so I would make these ridiculous jokes to get my students excited about what we were talking about. And I would say, forensic anthropology is not, and obviously, this is just, it's done by a phenomenal forensic anthropologist, but it's not really what we do. And we never look great when we're doing it. We were barely presentable when we're not doing it. And so I would laugh about this. And then about 6 years ago, I partnered with a retired Texas Ranger. And so my students, I would say, this is crazy, this doesn't work. And about 6 years ago, one of my students said, wait a second, you actually do have a booth. And so I want to introduce Sergeant Jim Huggins. He's been amazing in helping me to do so much more than I ever imagined we could do along the border. So I do laugh. My students call us Baker and Booth. And so we do have a little bit of a resemblance. And in the conversations with our administration about it not being a fad, they're like, oh, it's glamorous. People are going to imagine this. So I tell my students, this isn't going to happen. I keep asking the university, when am I going to get my fancy car? I haven't gotten it yet. What you are going to do as a student is travel much differently. I was on a forensic case. And here, so the back of a military transport without a pressurized cabin freezing to death going out to a site. So it's a little bit different, and we wonder, one of the things that used to baffle me, we have all of these folks that are so interested in forensic science, and I go to parties and they're like, oh, what you do is so fascinating, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I was looking at a 12-year-old today in the lab, and I was trying to figure out how this became entertainment, and I understand it so much better now. We're solving something. It's the mystery behind it and the ability to solve it in a way that actually has an application and is important to people's lives and what goes forward. So it's exciting to be able to do that, and I think that's what excites people about it. What I also like to tell my students, and luckily those of us that get into this enjoy this part way more than this part, because that's what we get. This is actually going to a prison island off of the coast of Panama to look for the disappeared under Noriega's regime. A very interesting story I'd be happy to tell you more about. My husband went with me on that trip. It's the last time he went with me on a trip. He calls them fantasy work camps because we make everyone work constantly. But Anthropologists do a number of things. We assist with the location and recovery of remains, which is it's a very important part. There's a lot to know to be able to do a good recovery of information. We determine the demographics of an individual. We look at trauma. We do postmortem interval, and really my goal is to get to a positive identification. Oh, sorry, I left that one in. This is also on the Panamanian island. We have these 2 archaeologists that are helping us, and then the 3 guards that were keeping us safe. This was an active prison island, and so it's where you send your worst rapists and murderers, and we went there to live for a while we were doing this work. I look back on it now, and I think, yeah, I wouldn't do that now that I have children. My husband, being there, played in their baseball league, broke his finger, and comes over, and he slips his wedding ring off, and his finger's just hanging there. And I'm like, oh my goodness, what are we gonna do? And he goes, don't say anything, don't show weakness. So you can see why he doesn't go with me any longer. It was actually a beautiful island. So locating human remains can be very difficult. Sometimes we're looking for clandestine graves. Sometimes we're looking for scattered remains. I thought it'd be worthwhile to show, this is a case that we did last fall. These are my students. All of the power behind everything we do comes from undergraduate students at Baylor. We have exceptional students, and they do so much incredible work. And so here they are on their hands and knees. We have an individual that was murdered, and luckily most people who perpetrate crimes are very lazy. And so this person was found by a hunter in Texas. That's how we find everything, by hunters. And there was a hole that was about this deep, and they just kind of put this guy over in it because it's really hard to dig holes in Texas. The ground is very difficult. So it was a bit easy to find some of him, but he'd been there for a while, and so his remains had become scattered in this heavily wooded area. And so we had to go out to try to find as much of him as possible. We like to do 100% recovery, and my poor students, we had a lot of bleeding and poison ivy after that. But can you see here, I've cleared it away a little bit. Here's kind of the leaf litter that we're going through. Can you see the bone in this picture? So it's right here. I tried to clear it off. That was a metacarpal, and so we needed to find a lot more of those. So we go through cleaning things up so that we don't miss anything, and you can see it's actually quite damaged because there's been a lot of animal activity. So we call ourselves professional landscapers. This is the site after we were done to make sure that we were not missing anything. Before, after. I went to school a long time to learn how to do that. Anyway, so here are my students working hard. We also are professional cleaners. So after we find remains, in order to be able to understand them and really look at the skeleton, we have to clean the bones so that we can actually see all the features. And this is an individual. I use this picture because it's not quite a disgusting picture because there's a lot of mummification. But this is an individual that we recovered from a South Texas cemetery who's unidentified, had been found 5 years earlier and buried in an unmarked grave. And so we can't determine much from what we found here until we do a whole lot of cleaning. And this is her skeleton afterwards. So these guys are the ones that do the bulk of that work. But it's so important for us to understand the skeletal system. So to understand everything we can about the bones. And what I like to say to my students is your life is documented in your skeleton. The skeleton is beautiful. We can look at things like whether you're male or female. We can look at the activities that you had during a lifetime. We can look and see past instance of starvation or disease. So it's a brilliant, amazing scaffold that holds your body together, that changes and is dynamic. There are a number of things that we have to do. One, we have to determine when we do find remains. I get a lot of calls from Texas Rangers. Doc, we found something. We don't know if it's human. And luckily, we're in an age of technology. Before it was 4 in the morning, Doc, we found something, you get dressed, you drive out 2 hours to the site and look at it, and it's a cow. Now that happens, and it's take a picture of it, put a coin beside it for scale, and I'll let you know if I need to drive out. So determining whether we have human versus non-human is very important, and because we are mammals, and there are many other mammals, sometimes that's a bit more difficult. So we try to learn everything that we can about all of the features, because it becomes more difficult even when you're working on old and fragmented remains. Sex estimation is something that we do, and it helps us to rule out 50% of the population when we're trying to determine who a person may have been. We do this in so many different ways. I like to use genetics to do it, but there are so many things on the skeleton that we can look at, not just size differentials, but shape differentials, because males and females are just shaped differently because we have different biological functions. And I felt a little bit gratified learning in college that the reason I have really big, unflattering hips is so that I can give birth to live offspring and our human race can live on. So it's a beautiful, wonderful thing. But because of that, because of the functionality of different areas of our body, and especially of the pelvis, there are different things that we can look at that are anatomically different between males and females. Age estimation is very important. When we're trying to narrow down the number of people that this individual could have been from missing persons reports, being able to estimate age is very helpful in doing that. And so we do that in a number of ways. We look at the development. So when we're looking at fetal remains through about the age of 15, we look at the development of the skeleton. When you get to be my age, you start to look at the degeneration of the skeleton. So I'm fully developed, and now it's just going downhill. So there are a number of indicators that we look at there. Ancestry is one of the more difficult things that we do. Humans are interesting. We move around a lot, and we have interesting histories. But we can look at certain things that are shared in geography and through our genetics. These are 2 skulls that you can see are pretty remarkably different, but they happen to be 2 skulls that we recovered in Cuba. But they have very different histories. This individual with this long, narrow skull is a Siboney individual. That's an indigenous group to the Caribbean. This individual turns out to be a Spanish immigrant. So very, very different backgrounds, but this is probably a 2nd or 3rd generation Spaniard that moved to Cuba. And under the right context, it's good to be able to tell the differences. Not always quite as clear. Then we look at trauma analysis. Trauma is really important in trying to determine cause and manner of death. And this individual was poisoned, as you can clearly see. And we look for the obvious first, and we assumed that it must be poison. Sorry, I have to make that joke. It's terrible, but I thought, wow, this is a little extreme. Somebody was quite angry in that case. But we need to be able to determine a few things. We need to be able to determine about the time that the trauma happened. Was it perimortem, around the time of death? Could it have contributed to the person's death? Is it antemortem? Did it happen while they were still alive? So we look at healing factors to make those determinations, which can help us tie into instances that are unique to people's lives. And we want to be able to look at the instruments that could have been used. And so we spend a lot of time describing what we see on the skeleton. We can also look at the number and sequence of events. So if you have a skull that has multiple gunshot wounds, there are several things that we can look at to sequence those gunshot wounds. I don't want to get too into that. Humans move around a lot. We're interesting. We are such interesting creatures. So even 100,000 years ago, we were traveling thousands of miles, and we traveled rather quickly without cars and airplanes. And it always astounds my students when we start looking and tracking different human ancestors. And I'm very interested in people movements. I've been mostly interested in people movements throughout North and South America. The problem is when you have large movements of people, you have folks that aren't able to do that successfully. We had about 7,500 migrant deaths last year. These are the ones that are recorded that we know about. And as you can imagine, most we don't necessarily ever hear about. In particular, right now, we see a lot of people that are moving through the Central American region. This is a train. It's basically called the Beast. And there are literally hundreds of thousands of people that are moving throughout Central America and Mexico using this as a form of transportation. And so there are numerous cases where we have children who've fallen off and lost limbs, and it's quite devastating. You can see some of these small children here. So I work along the U.S.-Mexico border. I used to do a lot of work in Arizona. I've done some in California, and I've been concentrating in Texas for the last, 7 years. And Texas has about 64% of the border, so we have a rather large area of people to cross, and it has an interesting background that I'll talk about in a second. But in the 1990s, the U.S. put into place a number of initiatives, and it was really to prevent people from crossing the border in urban areas where the largest number of people were crossing into the U.S. by putting technology, people, all sorts of resources, so that when people crossed, they were so likely to be apprehended that they wouldn't cross. Or if they chose to cross, they would have to choose to go into areas that are so inhospitable that they would be unlikely to make it. So we did see this effort to close the major corridors. So as we increased spending along the border, we actually saw apprehensions go down. And so there was a really good correlation. Of course, some of these can be tied to economic events, but it's a great correlation. When we saw spending increase 242%, apprehensions decreased 250. It's a nice correlation. The problem is there were some unintended consequences, and that is that it redirected migration. People still came. People still needed to come to the U.S. Why people come has changed, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But they chose to cross in these areas. This is actually a picture of Arizona because we saw that being the area first, dealing with the largest number of deaths. And so people didn't make it. This is in Texas, in the area that I've been working the last few years. So we saw this massive increase in death. I stole this from a friend of mine, Wayne Cornelius. He made a graphic starting in 1995, and if you see each of these diamonds clustered here, these are representing a certain portion of deaths due to or of undocumented border crossers. So that's 95, 96, and you're going to see the change in the migratory routes, and you're going to see this is 97, 98, 99, 2000, 2001. So we see this increased number, and we also see this happening in places that we haven't seen before. In Arizona, they went from 1998 having maybe about 14 undocumented border deaths in the Pima County area to having over 200 in just a short period of time, and not having the infrastructure to deal with that. We've seen almost 7,000 recorded immigrant deaths since 1998 when the U.S. government started recording the deaths along the border. We only record those deaths along the southern border because there aren't as many that are happening elsewhere. But it was disturbing. These numbers are quite overwhelming. And what I've found working in this arena for a while, there's so many more. We don't do a good job of documenting these cases, and I'll explain that as well in a minute. So what we saw is as we increased our spending, decrease in the number of people crossing, but we saw an increase in the number of deaths. So we've seen about a 692% increase in the number of in the percentage of people dying that are crossing. So why was this project that we started important? I learned, I'll tell you a quick story. When I was an undergraduate student, I went to Baylor. I had no interest in doing forensic science. I didn't know why anybody would want to do something that's sad all the time. And I had a professor that kept taking me out on cases. She made me go. She was a great mentor. This is good for you. You're going to learn something. You're going to come. I don't want to come. You're going to come. And we did this one case on the border, and there was a sheriff we were working with, and he was really nice. Back then, we didn't have bones. We didn't have CSI. There were a lot of questions. Why are you, how do you learn to do what you're doing? It's like, well, we study a lot of skeletons, we look at the variation, but you have to look at a large number of skeletons to really understand how much variation there is and to categorize that. And I said, we don't have a lot of skeletons at Baylor, but I'm going to the University of Tennessee where we have thousands of individuals that we can look and learn from. And he said, oh, so you need skeletons? It's like, well, yes. I can get you all the skeletons you want. And my professor and I are like, really? How can you do that? He said, oh, there's all these people dying. Nobody wants them. You can just have them. We'll send them to you. She didn't take me out on another case after that because I made it very clear that there were many people who would like to have their relatives back if he did his job. But I'm not much more diplomatic these days. I wish I could say I was wiser as I got older. We have a number of intricacies in the state of Texas that make the work that we do much more difficult than what we see in other states. We have a medical examiner system, but out of our 254 counties, only 14 have medical examiners' offices. And we all know the type of training and stringency that goes on in these labs. You're talking about people getting medical degrees, doing fellowships, residencies, massive amount of specialty training for a great deal of their life to be competent at looking at individuals and determining cause and manner of death. In counties that don't have medical examiners' offices, we have elected officials, justices of the peace, and they perform a number of duties, one of which is to go out to unattended deaths and determine the cause and manner and what happens in the investigation. So they're doing the same thing that medical examiners are doing, but without any necessary training. The eligibility requirements for justices of the peace: they have to be a U.S. citizen. They have to be at least 18 years of age. They have to be a resident of the county for 12 months, in the precinct for 6 months. You can't be a felon. And my very favorite is that you have to be mentally competent. On so many levels, it's the funniest thing. I mean, life is so much more interesting than fiction, and it's so unbelievable, but mentally competent. And I have yet to figure out who judges that element of this requirement. So it means that we have counties with folks that may not have the skills and the necessary understanding to do their job well. And I don't mean to disparage them. They don't always know that they're going to be in a situation of doing this. They don't know that their county is going to have a large number of migrants going through, and one year you're going to have 130 people who perish that you have to then figure out who they are and what to do with the remains and if there was any foul play. So I began this project. It was really great. I started doing work with my friends and going to places like prison islands and working with truth commissions in places like Peru. And when I was in Peru, right before I went to Texas, I was sitting in a group of forensic scientists, and these were folks from around the world. I was the only American, and I was there because I could talk about DNA analysis from bone. It was the Dark Ages, so not many people could do that. And we were going around the room talking about the things we were working on. It was very casual, and it was horrible. We had people working in Bosnia-Herzegovina on identifications and these horrible atrocities that happened. But we also had a member of the forensic anthropology team in Guatemala who talked about a mass grave that he was working on. And as you know, in Guatemala, there was a thought that if you eliminated the indigenous population, then you could elevate the status of the country and the economic viability. So in this small town, these individuals had gone and taken the children of the Maya. There were 34 that they found in this grave, and these are children that are newborn through the age of 4. And he was working on a mass grave with their remains. and we're listening to the story, and everyone's crying. He didn't find a single bullet in the entire grave because they didn't want to waste bullets on these children. So that lets you know how they came to pass. So I came back from Peru, looked at my husband, and I was like, well, they got to me. I should tell you that story. And they said, must be nice to be from the US. You don't have any of these problems. I said, well, we actually on the border, I learned about this problem when I was a student. It's always plagued me, and I wondered what we could do. And all of the individuals there, and I've been to their homes, they live very differently than we do. They said, oh my goodness, we're going to come, we're going to help. This is horrible. What are those families doing? This is an atrocity. And I thought, oh my goodness, here are these folks that are going to come to our country, and we can't even do this work ourselves. So I came back and I said, hey, honey, guess what? We're going to move to the border, and I'm going to start a project. My husband worked for Oak Ridge National Lab, and I told him that we were going to move to the border. And he goes, there's not a national lab on the border. I was like, yeah, I know. He's like, how are we going to do it? I'm like, I don't really know yet. But got a call from Baylor, and we went, and it was a little of a culture shock for him. But basically, it's still a culture shock for him. I really started this, and then I use all of his skills. He's a bioinformaticist. I'm like, ooh, honey, you can write a database for me so we can compare our DNA samples and store them and do this. And he's like, sure. But I won't take you in the field. And he's like, then it's worth it. So it's really just to aid in this identification process. I spend a lot of time going county to county and developing relationships, talking to sheriffs, talking to county judges, talking to JPs, and saying, I know that you have a problem. I know that you don't have the resources to do this. Do you want my help? And these are really good people. They want to identify people. They want their families to know what happened. They want these people to go home to their families, but they have no ability to do that. So that's what we do. We work in a number of arenas. Sometimes remains, and you'll love this, sometimes remains are mailed to you through the Postal Service, mostly through FedEx and UPS. You can track them. Had one come to my new office in the administration building, and that was a little bit of a hoopla because I'm not sitting in my lab anymore for it to be delivered directly. And then sometimes we go out and we exhume pauper graves, and I'm going to talk about that the most in a minute. And we create the biological profile, do the things I was talking about, and we've been working with the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, the NIJ, that's funded through the National Institute of Justice, and it's been an incredible tool for medical examiners' offices and work on the missing. We take DNA samples. We're now able to submit those to go into the national database. And we work with foreign governments to be able to do these identifications. So we've been, in the last few years, working specifically in Brooks County, Texas. Brooks County is in the Rio Grande Valley border sector. It's a rather narrow sector that has seen a massive increase in the number of people crossing. And in particular, in this area in Brooks County called Falfurrias, this small town has had this huge number of individuals that they've found deceased on these ranches crossing. They've had, they were having 3,000 people a day crossing through in the counties when I've been there in the summer, and it's overwhelming. You can see this is a heat map, and I started working there in 2012 because one of my friends, who's a reporter in San Antonio, said, "Are you working in Brooks County?" And I was like, "No, I don't even know where that is." And she said, they have a problem. I went, and they had 130 bodies that they couldn't identify. But they have 2 border checkpoints. As people cross here, they have to then get by these 2 checkpoints. So if they have smugglers bringing them across, the coyotes, they often will drop them off and then tell them they'll pick them up on the other side of the county. Sometimes they'll tell them when they drop them off here that it's really only a 3-hour walk to Houston. It's more than a 3-hour walk to the other side of the county. It's a 955 square mile county. So people aren't always prepared, and they're not able to do that. And they may have 1 bottle of water and a can of tuna. And so they can't survive through this. There are no forensic scientists in this town. In this county, there are 7,000 people that live in the county, 955 square miles. They have absolutely zero federal funding to work on immigration issues because they're not considered a border county. And about 40% of the population lives below the poverty line, so there are no resources to work on these cases. So I've worked in a lot of cemeteries. There are a few things that are just absolutely universal in Texas cemeteries with unknown, undocumented people. There's never a map. And you go, how can you have a cemetery without a map? In the first cemetery I visited on the border, I'm talking to the caretaker. Okay, can I see your map? Well, we don't have a map. Like, how do you not have a map? Well, we don't have a map. Okay, well, how do you keep from digging somebody up when you bury somebody else? Yeah, it happens all the time. Okay, this is going to be easy. I'm like, well, can you give me the numbers each year of people that you bury that aren't identified? No, we don't really keep that. Okay. Well, can you show me where these graves are? And they're like, oh, we just put them out everywhere. I'm like, okay, but they're marked. No, most of them, they're not marked. So it's very interesting. At least this cemetery had some marked graves. I would say about a fourth so far were marked, and with really helpful information that you can put together. This just says unknown remains. So it's a difficult process, and these are some of our students working in this cemetery, and typically unidentified individuals get really fancy places in the cemetery. Some of the stuff that I want to show you, it's very hot. I'm very proud of our students because they work so hard, and we have to do it around a university schedule, so we're doing it a lot of times in the summer when you don't really want to be on the border in Texas. So we start working before the sun comes up. We're working actually by flashlight here. When I take them out the first day, I'm like, okay, we'll be up at 5 and we're going to go work, and they're like, oh, Dr. Baker, really, 5? So early. I'm like, yeah, 5. We get out and we work, and about noon when you want to die, the next day they're like, can we go earlier? We really have to wait that long? Like, yeah, I thought so. So in Brooks County from 2013, actually 2013 to 2015, we recovered 168 bodies. In January, and then we've spent this amount of time getting them documented and into the system and DNA tested. Went back in 2017. My colleagues at Texas State have been wonderful in coming in to partner on this project, and they recovered 24 more individuals, and apparently there are going to be many more for us to find. We kind of think of it as a small mass disaster because the number of individuals that we're taking out of the graves is like looking at a plane crash, the number of people on an airplane. We have no idea how many people are still there. So it's a little overwhelming, and I'm always amazed because students are dealing with this. You think of a 22-year-old that's in the midst of this, and they do such a phenomenal job. The way that remains are treated they vary quite a bit. Here are a couple of the burials from the same area. Sometimes the bones are just thrown into a grave, not put into anything, and maybe some clothes thrown on top of them. Sometimes we find individuals that are buried in biohazard bags. Towards the end, they actually got good at it and used body bags and had wooden coffins. We started in this area, and you can see it's not extremely deep. They were in wooden coffins. It was easy. It was good. I was like, this is the best cemetery we've ever worked in. Then we started finding all of the rest. What was most disappointing, here's a properly done burial, but this is an individual in a garbage bag, and so is this, a kitchen garbage bag and a lawn bag. So these contain the remains, the final resting place of these individuals. Then there are biohazard bags when they would get fancy. So it's a little overwhelming to realize how little we value human life when it's not someone we know and invested in. These are a couple of my students. Because of the way the remains were interred, sometimes they're extremely damaged by the time we're able to, and that's post-damage. We see a lot of commingling where they had a number of people that were recovered, so they throw them into the same. I think this had 7 individuals. The worst one, however, was a burial that we found. This person's in one of those nice kitchen garbage bags that was put into the funeral home bag. So the county does pay the funeral home $1,100 to do these burials. The county thought that they were paying for them to be interred properly. This is what was happening. And the thing that really damaged my soul was that this bag by the funeral home that's doing the burial, their motto is dignity. I really had a hard time the next couple of days. So I now talk to my students. We are restoring human dignity, not just bringing information to families. So we have a lot of commingled remains. We have a lot of training that we do to help the counties understand and help the sheriff's offices who are doing these recoveries know how to do what they're doing better. I want to point out a couple of things that are interesting. Texas is an interesting state all the way around. You hear about it in the news and probably understand that as well as I do. If you look along the border, these are areas, the colored areas are places that are federal land or tribal land. This is the federal land that we have in Texas. The majority of Texas is privately owned, 98%. So having Border Patrol on private property is an issue. So we don't have a lot of rescues. It means that people, if they're going to choose to cross, have decided this is a pretty good area to go because you're crossing on private ranches. The areas we work in, I have a hard time understanding the scale. A ranchette is 15,000 acres. Most of the ranches we work on, 65,000, smallish ones are 35,000 acres. The King Ranch, which is the largest ranch, is 825,000 acres. And that's bigger than the state of Rhode Island. So we have an area that people can cross that's really underpopulated. It doesn't have federal patrols on it. It's made it an ideal crossing space. So we've seen the numbers of people crossing in South Texas go up tremendously. I work with the ranchers and talking about how do you find remains, and it's all opportunistic. Either they're driving and they see vultures, and that lets them know something's happened, and either cattle or now they actually think, oh, I hope it's not a person. Or they're just out. A lot of times it's dove hunting and people are out on the property. So it's opportunistic, and they think they probably, with their land usage, only find about 25% of the people that actually die there. So this is why it's difficult to find individuals. You can see if you're just driving across a ranchette, you're probably not necessarily going to see that somebody has passed away in this particular area from your car unless you're walking there. I did this just to show you. You can see the skull. We get a lot of just skulls until we explained how you can go and find the rest of the remains and what they look like. But the skulls kind of stick up. They get bleached by the sun. They're white, and people can find them. These orange flags are flagging all of the other skeletal remains that are here. We found part of this individual 3 football fields away. So the scatter that happens because of all of the wildlife on these ranches is pretty substantial. So we get a lot of cases like this. These are cases that come to us from the Sheriff's Department. Here we have, these are the remains that we received. You can see which bones they are. We have them colored in here. And there's not a lot. There are 206 give or take, bones in the human skeleton, depending on if you're a variant. And that's not a lot of them to go off of. So we've been doing training, and now the first time I went out on a case with the Brooks County Sheriff's Department, and we gathered all the skeletal remains, they said, we had no idea there were that many bones. I was like, yeah, let me show you how to find them. Now they do really comprehensive, great recoveries. So we don't always have a lot to go on. One of the other things we've added to the work we do is when we can, they don't always take GPS coordinates, but when we can locate where this individual was found, we go back out to see if we can find the rest of this individual. And then we do a lot of work in the lab. We do a lot of dental analysis. We look for individual traits. We see a lot of asymmetric skulls. We take a lot of measurements so that we can do comparisons and be able to give error estimates on the things that we determine, such as sex estimation and ancestry. And lately, we've been doing a lot of 3D scanning, which is phenomenal. The number of measurements that we can take when you're taking thousands of points on a skull is incredible. Plus, then we have a digital copy that we can send to people all around the world and have them look and compare and find things that we might have missed. One thing that was interesting, I thought for the longest time, when you pick up a skull, and this sounds crass and I don't mean it that way, you have 2 eye sockets and then your nose aperture. And it's a bit like a bowling ball. And all of the skulls we were finding had the bone poked out in the eye orbits, and they're very thin bones, so if you touch them, they can break. And I was afraid that the sheriff was picking them up by the eye sockets, and so I chastised them a little, and they're like, no, we don't do that. And I'm like, I think you do. Turns out this is vulture damage. Research done at Texas State University has shown that vultures can take every bit of flesh off of a human skeleton in 5 hours. It's pretty astounding. Now, vultures don't like to eat live things, and so when they're wanting to eat, they'll stalk a small calf, go in, and they poke the calf's eye out, wait for it to die, and then they consume. So that's apparently what is happening to these individuals, and we pray that it's happening after they're deceased. We do also find a number of things with individuals. It's always interesting to see what people bring. When I first started working in this area, I couldn't understand why people had razors and combs. I thought, if I'm traveling thousands of miles, why would I have a comb and a razor? And so people were coming to the U.S. to get jobs, and they needed to be presentable when they got here, and so that was one of the things that people brought along. A little heartbreaking. We see a number of things that are a bit unique. This case is nice because it has a nice star inlay in the tooth, and we're hoping that's something that will help us to figure out who this individual was, because a family member might see this. This is a new database that's just been launched recently by the Texas Observer. Jen Reel was a photojournalist that came to the lab and saw a number of the items that we had that we were documenting, and she was so struck by the fact that this one case, and I'll show you in a second, had a baseball. And why would you have a baseball? Why would you have a stuffed animal? And thinking about that, she wanted to do something where we could better showcase these items to families and connect this information. We can do it in the National and Unidentified Person System, but then you have all of the cases in the U.S. This is very specific to migrants. So she created this database and comes to our lab and takes these phenomenal photos. This one individual was traveling with a luchador mask. So it's interesting. It's not a tourist mask. This person was a wrestler. This is amazing, and I thought this will be the easiest case we've ever solved, and we still haven't been able to do that. This is the case with the baseball that she saw. So I'm very grateful. We're also working with forensic artists. PJ donated this for me on a case. It's the very first case I got when I came to Texas. He's still unidentified. He's 12, 13 years old, and it was just a year ago that I got to see his face for the first time, but very, very exciting to see him, how he would have been when he was alive. And so we're trying to do that now because we can get those out for family members to see, and it's a little easier to make connections. We've been very frustrated because of the number of children, and I'm almost done. I'll end with this. The number of children crossing the border has skyrocketed. In 2014, there were almost 80,000 children that were apprehended. In 2016, there were 102,105 children that were apprehended along the U.S.-Mexico border. Here, about 85% were unaccompanied. Here, about 59% were unaccompanied. The change in this, the number of children coming, were the messages that we're getting back to Central America was that you can send your children, we want them to be in the U.S. And we have this nice deferred action plan, so please send us your children. So people just rush to send their children because of the violence. It doesn't affect these children because they weren't here before 2012, and it's very difficult to get that translated properly. The reason we're seeing people more accompanied, these aren't children that are accompanied by family members, but adult males have learned that if they cross with a child, they're less likely to be sent back. So we see a pairing of adult males with children. And you can look, these are border sectors along the border. Tucson, Arizona always has a large number. This is the Rio Grande Valley. It's epidemic proportion. What's also interesting that I've noticed when I first started doing this work 15 years ago, individuals that cross were coming here for jobs. There's a lot we could have done back then if 9/11 hadn't happened to work on work visas. People needed money, they needed to send it back. We closed the border. It was too difficult to go back and forth across the borders, and then we'd see whole families smuggled in. But these were very, very poor people, and we could see that in evidence on their skeleton. We see this a lot in the dental work that we're seeing. People now are coming because of violence, and we're seeing middle-class people that have resources that are crossing. What's interesting in Texas and makes this a bit more challenging, these are the numbers from 2014, and they're exactly the same for 2016. 75% of the people crossing, people have this idea that it's mostly Mexican nationals coming across the border. It's actually about 75% of the folks are coming from other countries. Right now, mostly the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. We also see a number of Chinese individuals. We see a number of Africans and Middle Easterners. It's pretty amazing. Chinese smugglers are charging about $30,000 to help people get across the border. So we have this Northern Triangle, and we've been trying to study. My goal is not to have to do this work anymore. Unfortunately, there are enough people dead that this will go on well after I'm alive. But how do we stop having these folks travel? Why are they doing this? In identifying a Guatemalan child last year, I asked the mom, why would you let your 15-year-old travel from Guatemala to the U.S. by himself? I can't imagine doing that. I have a 13-year-old. I won't let him walk across the neighborhood by himself. She said, well, if he stayed, he had to join a gang. If he didn't join the gang, they would kill him. If he joins the gang, he'll probably die in the next 2 or 3 years. And we've seen it happen over and over. If he comes to the U.S., there's at least a chance. There's some hope at the end of that. And it's hard to argue with that. What do you say? And, this is what I'm hearing from all of the mothers these days. There's just no chance here. Because what we're seeing in these countries, you can look, this is the national poverty line. In Honduras, 66% of the population are living below their federal poverty guidelines, which are drastically different than ours. And if you look in places like Honduras, there were 90.4 people dying from intentional homicides per 100,000. It was the highest murder rate in the world. El Salvador has now passed it with 103 homicides per 100,000 people. It's not safe to live in these areas. Until we can help bring stabilization to these countries, people are going to keep coming. All right, so that doesn't seem like a happy way to end on. So I will say we do have some efforts along these lines, and we have had some really great senators and congressmen that are champions for this. We've started several new programs, and we're working in country to think about how we can develop new models for safety. We've got some of our alumni that are in Washington that have started a human trafficking institute and looking at the models that we can implement to stop human trafficking. So we are taking some proactive measures to stop people from leaving their country, and that's what it's going to take. People are going to be desperate, and they're going to keep coming until we can provide enough stabilization. And I think this is a worldwide thing that we need to provide help and support so that people can live in their own countries. All right. terrible way to stop, so I'll just say, I have to say thanks to a bunch of people. I don't do any of this work by myself. Sarge, Jim Huggins, our forensic team, we've had hundreds of students that have contributed massive amounts of hours towards this. The Joint POW MIA County Command has a central identification lab that's tasked with identifying our fallen service persons abroad, and they have taken a number of these cases to help Texas State University faculty and students. Even the University of Indianapolis has sent their faculty and students. The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, Jen Reel, who started that database, and there are so many other people that I can't even count. This is actually, I'm constantly amazed. I talked about Jen Reel. Jill Cohn is a writer, songwriter, musician in Seattle, and she actually wrote a song about the very first case that I worked on, talking about this woman who left her mom and her 2 daughters to come to the U.S. for a better life. And so I'm amazed at the way people are so giving and caring and thinking about these individuals. All right. Thank you.
All right, we have time for questions. I'll come by with the mic. Since we're videotaping and live streaming, we'll want to get the audio on tape. So I'll come by with a microphone. If you just raise your hand. We'll start in the back.
Patrick Schuley, a former student here. With your colleagues south of the border, I know that there's a lot of kidnapping of migrants along the route and holding for ransom. Untold gruesome stories that are being discovered. I know there was recently a mass grave just discovered this last week. Mm-hmm. Have your colleagues south of the border been specifically targeted for their work by corrupt or cartels?
Yeah, there have been a number of forensic scientists that have been murdered. Not as many forensic scientists as journalists and people who've been fighting the corruption in these countries. It's not a safe place to be, and it's not a safe place to work. I used to work quite a bit in Mexico, and after I had my first son, I was working on the femicides right across the border from El Paso, and I have an uncle who was in Mexico, and somebody came up to him on the street and said, your niece is doing a lot of work in Mexico. And he goes, yeah, she is. And I said, she's starting to step on her toes, and it would be a shame if anything happened to her young son because of what she's doing. So it is quite dangerous, and people that are working on that side of the border, it's much more dangerous than it is on this side of the border. And there are horrific things going on, and massive numbers of people that are dying on that side, not of natural causes. I will say we have a number of skeletons because they've never had any forensic science. We have a number of skeletons that show us that the individual was a victim of homicide, and those weren't investigated. These folks were killed in the U.S., and no one's looked to find their murderer. And we don't know until we identify people if they're foreign nationals or if they're U.S. citizens. So we are giving up our rule of law by not doing the proper due diligence on these cases, and it should make people very, very nervous.
Professor Baker, back here at the very back of the room.
My name is Melody Smith. I go to a high school west from here. You said that there was many mass graves and things on the south of the border. Has there any been things that you have figured out about people that have come over here and then have died?
Let me ask you to clarify that a little bit more. So what sorts of things?
Have you ever found out how they died or where they came from, and have you found their families and told them what happened?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We've identified, I don't know the exact number at this point, but hundreds of people, and been able to return them to their families. When we do that, sometimes we learn the circumstances of why they would travel. the first case that I had, that we had, the first identification that we made was of this woman who was 32 years old. She had 2 daughters. Her husband had left her. She lived with her mom in the Yucatan. Her mom barely spoke Spanish. She spoke a Maya dialect. They lived in a house with dirt floors and no running water. She had no idea how she was going to provide an education for her daughters so that they could actually flourish and have a different life than she did. So she decided to come to the U.S. to work to send money back until she could earn enough money to get them the things they needed in their education. So she crossed with her cousin, and her cousin was looking out for her. Sister said, don't make this journey. If you make this journey, you're going to be raped, you're going to be mugged, it's going to be horrible, and you could die. And she said, yes, but if I stay here, what am I going to do? I can't support my daughters. In the journey, she sprained her ankle, and her cousin tried to help her, so he helped to carry her along for a while, but they couldn't keep up with the group. And the Coyote, they paid a lot of money to bring them, said, we have to leave her behind, we have somebody to meet, I'll go back and get her. And this is the cousin's story. He was, I'm going to go ahead, but they're going to bring you along. Either he never went back to get her, or she had died before he got there. So we know a lot about that story, and I wish I didn't know those things about individuals and those reasons. We've talked to a lot of mothers, and the most motivating factor in all of this, you talk about closure, and there's no real closure when you go through something like this, but the process of grieving is very important to humans. We do it differently, but there's a certain process that's universal. And these mothers that I talk to, when we have an identification, I always want to know, was this worth knowing, or did I just make it much worse? Did you have this hope that was worthwhile, that maybe they were living somewhere and doing well and you just hadn't heard from them? And they say, no, the hope eats you alive. All I do is walk around aimlessly, and I don't know where to go. There's nothing that I can do to find out. There's no information that I can gather, and I have nowhere to be. When you gave me back my son or daughter, now I have a grave to go to. I can be with them. I can lay flowers on their grave. I tell my students this. When we were working 2 seasons ago on the border, the very first day we started, we had identified a young man from El Salvador, I believe, and his mom called us through the sheriff's office and wanted to speak to us. So we put her on speakerphone as we're standing around the graves we're about to exhume, and she thanks us for this work. She thanks us on behalf of all the families we'll never talk to and what it's meant to her. And this is a woman who just had her son identified a couple of days earlier. And she said, now I have a place to go and pray. And every one of my students, of course, they're in tears, and they just looked at me, and I was like, it's the thing we hear every time. That process, giving back that human dignity and giving people the ability to grieve the way they need to is very important.
Dr. Baker, we want to stay back in the back of the room.
Hi, thanks for coming. What bones or set of bones gives you the best shot at identifying someone?
Well, it depends on what we're trying to do with the identification. So we tend to really like skulls because they're brilliantly beautiful, but I think looking into the eyes of the soul, and we recognize them. We find a lot of information from the skull. We can do sex estimation, use it for ancestry estimation. We can use some of it for determining height. So that's really kind of a go-to skeletal element. But it's been incredible in the way that we've been able to build. Science is built on the shoulders of the scientists that were before you. And so building on what's been done, we can take the head of a femur and measure that and be able to tell you whether we have a male or a female. So it's amazing what you can learn from things that we would have never been able to do without the advanced statistical models that we have today.
All right, one more. I see some hands up front. Let me stay in the back for one more question.
Once you exhume the unidentified remains and learn what you can from them, does the process depend on the people on the other side searching your database in order to make the connection, or do you seek them out? And let me tag one more. When you after you exhume from the pauper's grave, do you organize the cemetery and rebury it so you could find it again?
No, so once we do an exhumation, if we don't have an identification because of the organization of these cemeteries, if we rebury the remains and we get an ID later, we'll never find them again. It's not a safe place because maybe they'll dig them up when they go to bury someone else. So we keep them in the lab, and this is for a number of reasons. But the most important is technology changes all the time, our techniques and our ability and our methods and protocols, and new methods come about. And if we have the remains in our lab, we can use those new methods, and they may lead us to an identification. Now I've forgotten the first part of your question. Oh, how do we make this match? So I've worked in a number of countries to create missing persons databases, so that there'll be records of people that are reported missing, so there'll be information there and information here. We have a very difficult time connecting that. There is an organization in Arizona, a nonprofit organization called Calibri, and they focus on that. They work with the families of the missing, and specifically the missing of undocumented immigrants, and they've built a database of thousands of these cases that we can then use and make comparisons. But that's the most difficult part. And so there are a number of people like the Argentine Forensic Anthropology team, the International Committee of the Red Cross, who spend a lot of time going around and collecting information about the missing and collecting DNA samples. And then we can use that to make comparisons with the remains that we find. Yeah.
Hi. You said that people that you helped, they thanked you. I would like to thank you, even though I don't have any relatives and will not have any relatives involved in this, but we truly appreciate what you do on both sides. The thing that I wanted to ask you, I was reading today, and they were talking about the fact that some illegal immigrants are not going to be doing food stamps now because they're worried about being discovered. Well, after I read the article, they had people commenting, pages and pages of people that were incredibly hostile about illegal immigrants. Nothing positive, just, people that felt very strongly against them. So my question to you is, I can't help but think, has this affected your work at all? Do you see more people coming out and feeling very, very strong emotions about this? And how do you deal with it on a daily basis?
There are a lot of people in the U.S. that are suffering, that are poor and don't have the resources that they need or the health care they need for their families. So I keep that in mind a lot. We get a lot of hateful comments. I used to even get written letters. Why are you wasting your time on these individuals? I don't read the comment sections anymore in articles. I started to collect them for a while, and then it just really damaged me. But people that are like, good, I'm glad they're dead. We won't have to pay anything else for them. And I can't believe you're using you're using our tax dollars to do this work. I get that a lot, and it's like, read the article. We have never taken a dime from the U.S. government. We are funded by people volunteering to do the work. The university helps to subsidize the work we do, and by gifts and donations. And that's very important for a number of reasons. But we're not asking it to be done on the backs of American taxpayers.
Do you extract DNA from the remains and then go to the country and extract DNA from a close relative?
Yes,
and
yes.
Is that how a lot of matches are made?
That's, we always confirm our matches with DNA comparison. So if we're able to make a match on circumstantial evidence, maybe off of people hide things in their clothing because they're going to be robbed so many times along the way. So if we find a wedding ring that's sewn into the band of pants, that's something that people will usually recognize. So if we find a circumstantial match such as that and the characteristics fit, of course, even when they don't, we get a DNA sample to make sure. By Texas law, we're required to take a DNA sample of all unidentified remains. By Texas law, all of these cases have to go into the National Missing Persons Database. Before a couple of weeks ago, the DNA was submitted to the University of North Texas for DNA analysis, and that's a Texas law. Maybe 10% of the cases that I've looked at actually had DNA samples taken, and none of the cases I've looked at are in the National Missing and Unidentified Person System. And that's by law. These great elected officials who are mentally competent don't get to that process.
All right, let's have two more questions. Back here.
Hi, thank you for humanizing undocumented immigrants. I really appreciate that. I wanted to ask you if, aside local law enforcement agencies and aside international agencies, do you by any chance work with any local organizations, especially in Falfurrias?
Yes, we do. There is, and I should have had them on the thinking slide, and I can't believe that I don't. The South Texas Human Rights Center was established in Falfurrias in 2012, and they have done a phenomenal job because of the large number of people in this Rio Grande region reaching out to families and trying to get information about the families. They've also had a mission of going around and putting these large barrels full of gallons of water in areas where there are high traffic so that people will have access to water when they're coming. I mean, if you have hundreds of people walking through these certain areas, I'm sure they've saved a lot of lives by doing that, and it's an incredible organization. There are so many groups, No More Deaths, the Desert Angels. We love them all, and we work with everybody that wants to work with us. There was the rescue of a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old when we were working the first year in Falfurrias, and the Desert Angels from California, Raphael, was there with us and helped with that.
I had a question concerning the hotspots from the private ranchers in Texas. Are you utilizing like human remains detection dogs? Are these ranchers receptive to you coming? Do they want to find these people, or are they just as soon you stay away?
That is a really good question. We have been embraced by these communities. Ranchers have our team out. I mean, because we're paying for our time there, and students are figuring out ways to pay for their time to volunteer on this. And so they'll bring us out to the ranches, have barbecues for us, and take care of us when we're there. They're very welcoming. The problem is, and with the human rights groups, and what we've had is a problem with the South Texas Human Rights Center, if you allow people on your personal property, these aren't easy places to get around. It's hard to have a vehicle that can actually drive out because the deep sand is so thick. We always go into four-wheel drive vehicles, so there's one to pull the other one out as you go along. And walking across it is very, very difficult. If you have folks that are doing these good works and something happens to them when they're out on your property, you're liable for that. And it's a risk that the ranchers have to decide if they can take, and they can't always dedicate the personnel to be out with those searching. So they try to accommodate as much as they can, but it is asking them to take a personal liability to do this.
Professor Baker, over here on your left, I had said that was going to be the last question, but we have one more via Twitter. What are your thoughts on the proposed border wall, and will that affect?
You know,
in relation to your work.
I do a really good job of not putting political commentary in, but there are these really fabulous political cartoons. It does make it harder to cross the border if you put up a wall. But we're humans, and we're tool users, and we adapt our environment. So if you put up a wall, I'm going to use some wire cutters. You put up a wall, I'm going to build a ladder. I mean, there are ways around that. And in really entrepreneurial spirits, will build the ladders, rent them out for the people that are crossing. So it's probably not a good long-term solution. I can tell you in Texas, the ranchers do not want it. I mean, Texas, we stole Texas from Mexico. We have people, relatives on both sides of the border. I'm a native Texan. Our businesses have done business with people on both sides, but ecologically, putting up a border, we don't just have humans that go back and forth. We have a lot of species that go back and forth, and it changes the ecological zone. It is a beautiful country despite the horrible things that are happening there, and it really does make a difference. And most of the ranchers that I know do not want this to happen and don't really see it as a good deterrent. I don't know. Maybe it would solve it, maybe it wouldn't. I'm doubtful.
Well, we'll leave that question to be determined later. So thank you, Dr.
Thank
Baker,
you.
for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And thank you again for attending tonight's exhibition opening and lecture. We hope to see you back at the library soon. Thank you and good night.